Killers of the Flower Moon has been a very long time coming. Scorsese and DiCaprio have been attached to the project since summer 2017, just a couple months after David Grant's nonfiction book was published. Production was supposed to start in 2018, but got pushed back because of post-production on The Irishman. Production was then supposed to start in March of 2020, but it finally started shooting April 2021, and for nearly 2 full years, this was the only production still we had to go on. I start with this background because, number one, any Scorsese movie is going to have a lot of hype and anticipation, but the long gestating nature of this project built up like an ungodly amount of anticipation. And for my money, the movie fucking delivered and was worth the hype and worth the wait. But number two, the 13-month delay between the March 2020 and April 2021 shooting starts allowed Scorsese to really change the scope and point of view of the movie. And the fact that the movie began as one thing, but ended up being this other thing instead, says a lot about the why behind the movie. The movie opens with mourning and a funeral of sorts. Not for a person, but for a culture. The Osage Nation elders are gathered to bury a peace pipe and mourn the fact that their children and descendants will be taught by white Americans, and their heritage and culture will slowly ebb away. But this ebbing is delayed due to the discovery of oil on their land, and the Osage people become the richest per capita in the world. In 1919, Ernest Burkhart, played by Leo DiCaprio, arrives in Oklahoma to work for his uncle, a wealthy businessman and ostensible benefactor of the Osage, William King Hale, played by Bob De Niro. In their first sit-down after Ernest arrives, you can tell immediately that Hale has plans for Ernest, asking him if he likes women, if he likes red, his words, and if he has any venereal disease from the war. Yes, yes, no. Ernest begins working as a driver for a wealthy Osage woman named Molly Kyle, played by Lily Gladstone. Molly and her mother and her sisters have what's called head rights, which is basically full land ownership in this oil-rich area, making them considerably wealthy.
When these women die, with how Osage suffer from illness, you have to make it the head rights come to you. You see?
At the urging of his uncle, Ernest develops a romance with Molly, and they eventually marry. Meanwhile, a lot of Osage people, young, healthy people, are turning up dead under mysterious circumstances, and no one is really investigating these deaths. There's a brief montage of this narrated by Gladstone's Molly that concludes with one of the most upsetting single shots I've seen in a Scorsese movie, and that's fucking saying something. Eventually, and I do mean eventually, it takes a long time, Washington sends someone down to Oklahoma to investigate the murders, that someone being Tom White, played by Jesse Plemons.
I was sent down from Washington, D.C. to see about these murders.
See what about them?
See who's doing it.
And Tom White and his team very quickly determine who's behind all this because it's frustratingly obvious who's doing it. It just took years to get anyone to pay attention, and that's the point. When I first saw this in theaters in October, I was pretty overwhelmed just because there's so much movie here. Scorsese movies are usually or always very kinetic and propulsive and compelling, and even though this runtime is just shy of 3.5 hours, it is absolutely kinetic and propulsive and compelling for 206 minutes. So again, I was overwhelmed just because there's so much to wrap your arms around here. But one thing I knew for sure immediately is that Lily Gladstone is a revelation. She goes toe-to-toe with either DiCaprio or De Niro in most of the scenes she's in, and you can't take your eyes off her. She steals the show from two of the best, most captivating actors of the last 50 years. Her character really thinks before she speaks, and seems to say a lot with her eyes.
Somebody described her eyes like a face like Olivia de Havilland. Whenever she was in the frame, to me, being a Southern Italian background, for me it's like the Renaissance. For me it's like Madonna. Her face, her eyes, but then she has that edge, but the edge always had a little smile to it. Like, I know you whites.
It's a subdued performance until it's not, and she's sidelined for a good portion of the second half, but her absence is heavy. The sidelining of her character leaves a pretty purposeful hole in the movie. I think Leo DiCaprio is at his best in one of two modes, when he's either leaning into his superhuman level of charisma, or when he's zagging and doing a complete rejection of his charisma and playing an insecure, off-putting weirdo. This is firmly in the latter category. I remember when Margot Robbie got nominated for Best Actress for I, Tonya, In an interview, she talked about doing animal work to play Tanya Harding, and she picked a bulldog and had a bulldog in mind in how that character carried herself. I can only assume Leo DiCaprio either watched those same interviews or went to the same acting coach, because he's really going for it with that underbite. The underbite and the growly bulldoggy voice are certainly a choice, but I like when great actors make choices. I like this. I haven't seen all the Best Actor nominees yet, but based on what I have seen, I think it kind of sucks that DiCaprio wasn't nominated for this. This dude on Twitter astutely noted that the acting nominations went kind of the way of The Irishman, where the most and the least sympathetic characters get nominated, but the main character might be too passively awful and may have off-put the voters. Like Frank Sheehan, the titular Irishman, Ernest is ultimately just a lackey for a crime boss and is very passive. He's always just taking orders, even when they directly hurt people close to him.
I just love money. I love it as much as I love my wife.
The person giving him orders is King Hale, played by Bob De Niro, who I thought was great in The Irishman. And just like Leo should have been nominated here, De Niro should have been nominated for The Irishman. But De Niro's even better here. This is the best performance Robert De Niro's given in like 3 decades. Since like Heat, probably. He's both very charming and legitimately very scary. It was his character in Goodfellas that inspired this line.
See, your murderers come with smiles. They come as your friends, the people who have cared for you all of your life, and they always seem to come at a time when you're at your weakest and most in need of their help.
And King Hale shares a fair amount in common with Jimmy Conway in Goodfellas. On that subject, one of the more interesting aspects of the movie, and arguably the whole point of the movie, is that it doesn't really hide who the villain is. There are reveals, and they're well done and well placed and are dropped in with little fanfare, but they're not remotely surprising. There's not really a great mystery or even much of a cover-up. They got away with these murders very easily for a very long time because no one seemed to care enough about the victims to properly investigate. In some cases, it is literally laughable how obvious the perpetrators were. The movie's pretty shit serious for obvious reasons, but the biggest laugh line in my theater involved Sally Bugs from The Irishman broadcasting his intentions to commit cold-blooded murder in order to inherit money. And the laugh comes from the fact that he has no clue how obvious he's being. He thinks he's being slick. David Grant's book is subtitled The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. I haven't read it, but it's my understanding that Tom White, an agent of the then called Bureau of Investigation, is a major figure in the book, if not the main character, as he's the one who led the team of investigators who ultimately solved these crimes. Reportedly, Eric Roth's version of the screenplay that they very nearly went into production with pre-pandemic reflected this. Tom White was the main character and was to be played by DiCaprio. And it was more of an investigative whodunit movie. And at the time, it was supposed to be financed and distributed by Paramount. As I said, that version of the movie was supposed to start production in March 2020, but it didn't. And during the production hiatus in May 2020, The Hollywood Reporter reported that there were significant script changes happening at the behest of Leo DiCaprio. Specifically that he was no longer playing Tom White and was instead playing Ernest Burkhart. So the ostensible hero of the movie to one of the ostensible villains. By the way, it was presumably Scorsese himself rewriting the script, as he has the other screenplay credit alongside Eric Roth, only the 7th time he's had a writing credit out of the 26 narrative feature films he's directed. In that same May 2020 Hollywood Reporter article, they also reported that Paramount was selling the movie to Apple, as Paramount felt the script changes turned the film into a moody, less commercial character study. Once the script had been changed, Paramount allowed DiCaprio's agent to shop the project around, likely hoping that no one would pick it up given the price tag. The plan being that if no one picked it up, Scorsese would have to come crawling back to Paramount to make the Eric Roth version of the movie with the original budget. But the deep pockets at Apple stepped in to make the movie that Scorsese and DiCaprio wanted to make. The change in focus and scope really illuminates what the movie ultimately is. Is the story of these real-life murders one of heroic law enforcement eventually solving the case? Or is it a gross miscarriage of justice that these crimes continued for as long as they did, in broad daylight, because for a long time no one seemed to care enough to investigate? Is this a triumph or a tragedy? The filmmakers, when given the time to reflect on it, chose the latter. This is a deeply cynical movie. Cynical about the historical power dynamics in the United States, about our values, about our laws, and about our stories and who tells them. Scorsese met with lots of Osage people in Oklahoma during pre-production and had Osage cultural consultants on set, but still very textually recognizes his limitations as a storyteller. Chris Cote was one such Osage language consultant on the movie, and he said at the premiere that he had hoped the movie would take an Osage perspective and be through the eyes of Molly, but he acknowledged it would probably take an Osage person to make that kind of movie, and that Scorsese made the movie from the perspective that he knew, not as a victim of this terrible violence, but as an observer to it. The movie poses the question, where does complacency end and culpability begin? And Scorsese argues here that the culpability extends to himself as the storyteller. His last movie, The Irishman, certainly felt like a filmmaker reckoning with their life work. It was a movie about taking stock of what you've put into the world, what the sum of your work has meant, looking back on it, apologizing for it in some way, rationalizing it. Applying this both to Frank Sheehan and to Marty himself, it's an old man looking back at the gangster shit they'd done and the violence they put into the world. He's kind of doing this again with Killers of the Flower Moon. The movie ends with a very sobering coda about how the story of these murders might be relayed to a mass audience, and how the real-life people who survived this massacre had to live out their days with this whole thing casting a big shadow over the rest of their lives. Making a movie about it is, in some sense, shining a light on this moment as a cautionary tale about evil allowed to run rampant in the absence of justice, but that shining of a light is a small consolation. Too little, too late.